Once you've faced him, once you've heard the gospel, you will never be the same today.
This man is dangerous to us.
It says he is the true Lord of Lords.
Claimed to be a new Messiah.
But no one believes
Sinful
him.
thoughts.
We can stand and proclaim good news that God is love.
What's up, guys? I have a bit of a disclaimer for you. I'm sitting on a stool, and I feel awful. So I woke up this morning and, puked my brains out, and yeah. So it's been one of those mornings, and I was talking to Sean and Michaela and Nemo, and was just like, hey, I'm going to be there, but I'm just going to teach, and then I'm going to get off stage. Because I want to be here. I want to be here with you guys. And today's message is actually kind of pointed by the fact that I'm sick, is almost an LOL. And you'll hear why in a minute. But I want to be here, and I want to teach, but I'm going to ask something of you this morning. Usually I'm walking up and down the aisles and gonna be very engaged with you guys as a crowd. I'm literally not gonna get off this stool. So you're gonna have to give me a little more today. Can I ask that? Am I allowed to ask that? Okay, cool. Thanks. I'm wearing my UGG boots too, just in case. Just in case I need to puke in one of them, I would not recommend extra tall boots. John chapter 10 is where we're at, guys, and we're going through the fourth I am statement in the book of John. If this is your first time in this series, or even first time at Fuel, this isn't normal. I don't normally wear UGG boots. Okay, but John chapter 10, we've been going through these I am statements of Jesus. I think it's important for us as Fuel 910 to, if we claim to follow a Jesus and sing to a Jesus, that we would know who that Jesus said that he was. Right? It's one thing to hear things about somebody else. It's another thing for you to claim yourself. Here's who I am. So we've been walking through this series so far. We've hit, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. Last week we hit, I am the gate, him talking about, again, using kind of that analogy of come through me, walk through me, and you will be saved, and you'll find pasture. And we talked about that concept of finding life that's actually life. And then we had a kind of a side shoot-off message with Heather and Sean at one point where they talked about, I'm the resurrection and the life, talking about the life and death of Lazarus, and then Jesus claiming that he is restoration. He has the power to bring dead things back to life, and not just physically dead things, but talking about the restoration of life, kind of that newness of life. So today we're talking about I'm the good shepherd. In verse 11 of John chapter 10, I have that circled, and I just put a little number 4 next to it. It says this, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is the hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Underline that line right there. I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. As you're taking notes today, what I would challenge you to write down at the top of your note sheet is, what do I do? What do I do when the good shepherd doesn't feel very good? What do I do when the good shepherd doesn't feel very good? And I'm going to encourage you, I always encourage you to take notes because we are forgetful human beings, but I would encourage you to take notes, especially today, because if this isn't applicable to you right now, I promise it will be at some point in your life. If there's one thing I know about living the Christian life, even living a non-Christian life, it's that difficulty will find you. Whether it's relationally, if it's in your own family, at school, in a job, whatever it may be, We're not promised, like, come to God and you'll live this skate-free life. Come to God and your bank accounts will be full and you'll never experience stress and anxiety. It's actually quite the opposite, right? Like, Jesus' 12 original followers, 11 of them were killed for following him. Like, it's not this, hey, come to me and you'll be chilling for the rest of your life. Now, Jesus says, like, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. So what do we do on this side of heaven when the good Father doesn't feel very good? When it doesn't feel like singing that song is very easy? Right, that's a pretty popular song. It's been around for a while. But have you ever been singing that song or even just looking at the words and thought, you have been so, so good to me? Yeah, right. That thought ever crossed your mind? You've been so, so kind to me. Doesn't feel like he's being very kind to me right now. And what do we do when a worship song is hard to sing? What do we do when, like, the life that we're experiencing right here, right now, like what we're feeling, it doesn't reflect this claim that Jesus says, I am the good shepherd? Right? For me personally, over the last 6 months, I got married like a little bit over 6 months ago, and it's been awesome. Like, life with Paige has been super fun. There's also been like a lot of difficulty. People, like mentor figures of mine and hers, are continuously like, well, you guys are really going through it in this first year of marriage. And just like some stuff with her family, some health stuff for both her and I. Even just a silly thing like Scout dying. We had a puppy, for those of you that don't know, that we had for like 6 weeks, and just like freak accident, he died. And it's just like, it feels a little bit like we can't catch a break. Do you ever feel like you go through seasons of life like that where you're just like, like, why does this keep happening? And yet, like, if I take a big step back, I'm like, I live in Southern California. I have a roof over my head. Like, I have an awesome wife. I love my job. Like, I have it pretty good. And whether it's interacting with people in Ecuador or Africa or different parts of Asia that are just, they don't have it that good. And yet they can walk through life claiming to know this Father and this shepherd that says, I am the good shepherd. How do we justify those things of when life doesn't feel very good? How do I follow the good shepherd? Does that make sense? That's kind of the question we want to ask. So there's an awesome story if you want to read it sometime this week. It's in Genesis chapter 37 all the way through 50. It's like this 13-chapter story of this guy named Joseph. And Joseph's a legend. Like, if I get to heaven and there's big screen TV and a bunch of DVDs, I want to pop in the story of Joseph, or maybe even sit down with him face to face, wait in the long line that's waiting to talk with Joseph. But he lived this life that's unbelievable. And speaking of not being able to catch a break, so we pick up the story in Genesis 37. You don't have to turn there. I'm going to kind of give you the synopsis of it. But Genesis 37, we pick up the story with a 17-year-old Joseph. So how many of you are 16 in this room? Okay, handful of you, 15, 14. Cool. Any like rogue 13-year-olds in here? Trevor, mentally? Okay, cool. Love you, Trevor. So there's this story of Joseph, and Joseph, he's this 17-year-old kid, and he's pretty cocky when we pick up the story of Joseph. His dad, he's the youngest of all his brothers, and his dad gave him this like multicolored coat, which makes him feel special. And he has a dream about all his brothers bowing down to him. And like, if you have a dream of everybody bowing down to you, I recommend not waking up the next morning and going, hey, everybody, guess what? You're all going to bow down to me. Like, and that's what Joseph does. Like, he has this dream, then he goes to his brothers, and immediately, like, he's kind of got his shoulders back, and his, like, chest puffed out, and he's like, you guys are going to bow down to me. And they're like, okay, multicolored boy. Okay? And then he has a second dream where the sun and the moon and the stars all bow down to him. And he, again, goes to his family, and he's like, what's up, fam? Like, you're probably going to bow down to me again. And at this point, his brothers are pretty over it, as you can imagine. Any youngest siblings out there? Hey-yo, me too, okay? So we know how to like push our siblings' buttons, right? Like, you learn it, you know it. Joseph is pushing, he's like button mashing on his brothers, okay? And his dad sends him out to go find his brothers. They're like out in the field working it. And he goes out and he finds his brothers. And they see him coming from a far way off, and they do the biggest eye roll of all time. They're like, oh my gosh, like Joseph, this guy, why is he out here? I'm over it. Like, let's kill him. And it's like, whoa, like harsh. Like, where did that come from? Like, all of a sudden, like, it's just, we went from really annoyed to let's kill him. And Reuben, thank God for Reuben, one of the brothers says, yo, like, slow your roll. Let's not kill him. What if we just throw him in this pit? Which is not that much better, right? So they throw him in this big old pit, and then Reuben takes off. He's like doing something, taking care of the fields, doing his job, whatever. And he comes back, and his brothers, they're like, well, if we can't kill him, next best thing, let's sell him into slavery, okay? And I'm not making this up. It's in the Bible. Read it. I read the whole story yesterday, and it's like, this guy can't catch a break. And so they throw him into the pit. They sell him to these people called the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites sell Joseph to a guy named Potiphar, okay? So, like, already in Joseph's short life, he's been kind of betrayed by his family, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and now he's owned by a guy named Potiphar. Like, the story's not starting out great for our boy. So Joseph kind of rises to the top of the ranks in Potiphar's house, and if you've ever had a moment in life where something really gnarly happened, and then you fast forward a little bit, and it's like, oh, like, this is why that happened. It seems like this is the moment for Joseph in the story where you're like, oh, okay, like, sucks to be sold into slavery, but kind of cool that you have all this influence in Potiphar's house. So he, like, rises up to the top, and Potiphar says, like, all the power in my house, it's yours. Like, no decisions made that doesn't go through you. You're in charge of everything. It says in the story that Joseph was a handsome devil. And so Potiphar's wife gets interested, you could say. And so one day, she walks up to Potiphar, she walks up to Joseph, and women must have been much more forward back then, because she just looks at him and says, come to bed with me. And Joseph's like, yo, no, like, you're my boss's wife. I can't do that. I'm not going to come to bed with you. And so in the wisdom, I love this kind of like side note of the story of Joseph. In his wisdom, it says that he not only said no to her, but he chose to not be around her anymore. Does that make sense? Like, there was this thing in his life that was temptation, and that was drawing, like, him away from faithfulness both to Potiphar and to his God. And not only did he say no, but he chose to alienate himself from it. He said, I'm not even going to be around you anymore. Like, I can't handle being around you. Fast forward a little bit in the story. One day, Joseph comes to work, and he's like whispering, hi ho, it's off to work we go. And he comes into work, and Potiphar's wife, it's like, has sent everybody out of the house. So he walks in, and he's like, guys? And all of a sudden, it's like Potiphar's wife like walks around the corner and does like a hair flip, and she's like, hey there, big boy, right? And he's like, yikes. And she, again, forward, she says, come to bed with me. And he's like, no. And he runs away from her, and she literally tries to like physically stop him. She grabs his coat, rips it off of him. Like, homegirl was aggressive, okay? As Nehemiah would say, chill, okay? So he says it all the time, right? So she grabs his coat. He runs away. Again, notice. He doesn't just say, oh, actually, no, like, I'm not going to do that. He literally runs. And I think there's like a piece of wisdom in here of, there are moments that I think you and we need to run. Like, there needs to be moments where we're face-to-face with temptation, we're face-to-face with something that we know we're going to say yes to, and I think sometimes we need to run. We need to physically remove ourselves from scenarios. So he runs, he gets himself out of there, and homegirl, Potiphar's wife, uses his coat to twist the story. Okay? In her, obviously, shame, embarrassment, all of those things that she's feeling, she cries out to all the other slaves and says, look, the Hebrew boy Joseph, he tried to sleep with me, he tried to come into bed with me, here's his coat, this is my evidence. Okay, like so twisted, right? Like so twisted, so broken. Joseph's done nothing wrong in this scenario. Potiphar comes back, gets angry with Joseph, obviously, because he thinks that Joseph tried to sleep with his wife. So he throws him into prison. And this is like, oh my gosh, moment number 7 in the life of Joseph, right? Like, he just, and again, remember I said you ever walk through something gnarly to get to something where you're like, oh, I think this is why. And then that even to be taken from you, and then you're like, wait, what? Like, God, I thought I understood what you were doing here. Like, gnarly circumstance, I get it. It prepared me for this other thing. And then gnarly circumstance 2.0, like, wait, how, why, how, where? So it says Joseph gets thrown into prison. And I'm not like an Egyptian scholar or anything, but prison in the United States of America is pretty terrible. And you get 3 square meals, a bed, all that. Prison in a third world country like Ecuador that I grew up in is awful, like terrible. Prison at this time in Egypt, like a dungeon, it could not have been nice. Like, I guarantee you there wasn't like a bench press and like 3 square meals a day. Like, this was not glamorous prison. This was not like Hollywood's rendition of prison where it's like, it kind of sucks, but it's also kind of looks cool and you get to be buff at the end. So worth it, right? Like, this is not Joseph's prison. So he gets tossed into this dungeon. And it says several years go by of him just in this dungeon. And again, because of Joseph's faithfulness, at this point, for me, honestly, if I put myself in this story at this point, I think I'm shaking my fists at heaven going, really, God? What God? You've been so good to me? Ha, good shepherd? Sure. Like, yeah. Uh-huh. Because why? Thrown into a pit. Sold into slavery, abandoned by his family. His dad thinks he's dead. Bought by Potiphar, betrayed by Potiphar's wife, thrown into prison, and now years in prison. Years. Okay, and again, here's number 2 moment where you're like, okay, I think I see where this is going. Rises up again because of his faithfulness, because of his perseverance. He rises up to the top of this prison, into this dungeon. Okay, gets in leadership at the dungeon. If you know anything about Pharaoh was kind of like his word goes, like anything Pharaoh says happens. And so Pharaoh has a cupbearer that's their single job is to walk up to Pharaoh with his wine or whatever beverage of choice he has for the day, drink it, wait a little bit, and go, okay, I didn't die. You can drink this now, Pharaoh. Like, that's this dude's job, literally. And then he has a baker, right? Like every good Pharaoh does. And so his chief baker and his chief cupbearer, they did something to anger Pharaoh. They get thrown into the same dungeon that Joseph's in. They both have dreams. Joseph ends up interpreting this dream for them. One of them, it goes well. The other one, like one of the cupbearer, he says, you're going to get restored to your position. The baker, he interprets his dream and says, you're going to die. Right? And it ends up happening to both of them. And like Joseph makes the simplest request of all time. He looks at the cupbearer and he goes, hey, like I interpreted your dream. You're going to be back in your position. You have the Pharaoh's ear. I just ask one thing, like one thing. Will you remember me when you go back out there and you're in your job again? The cupbearer's like, for sure, I got you, okay? And then the cupbearer forgets Joseph. And you're like, oh my gosh, like Joseph, you're going through it, my guy. And it says several years passed again. Okay, so like not only did cupbearer forget him, but he forgot him for years. At what point, if you're Joseph, do you just throw in the towel and go, life, it's not for me. Like this whole life thing, it's not on my side. Like clearly nothing is going my way. And yet you see the only response of Joseph, and now don't get me wrong, I think there were seasons of life that Joseph walked through where he cried out to God and he said, I don't get it, I don't understand it. And we have a God big enough, we see it with King David all the time, that can handle our anguish and our pains and our doubts and all those things. But we also have a God that requires perseverance and faithfulness. And so Joseph, fast forward a couple years, the cupbearer is next to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh has a dream. And it's this dream that nobody can interpret, and the cupbearer has this like ding light bulb moment where he's like, once upon a time, I knew a guy that could interpret dreams, right? And you're like, you idiot, okay? And they go and get Joseph, and they pull Joseph out of prison, and he walks before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asks him the question, I had a dream, can you interpret it? And friends, remember what I said about Pharaoh? Like, Pharaoh's word goes, right? Like, if there was one person in life at the time to impress, it was Pharaoh. Like, he was the one who could turn your life around. And you know what Joseph's response is when he says, I have a dream, can you interpret it? He says, no, I can't. And you're like, what? Like, just lie. Like, bro, like 13 years you've been suffering now. Like, just say you can. Make something up. And he goes, no, I can't. But I believe in a God that can. And you're like, oh, like, Joseph, you're a freaking legend. Like, no joke, 13 years. We pick up the story right there, and it says Joseph is 30 years old at this point. 13 years. Okay, I'm 26. Am I the oldest person in this room? Think so? Okay, I'm 26, and that's half my life. Okay? That's half my life. 13 years. For those of you that are 14, that's most of your life. 15, 16, that's a solid chunk of your life to be just walking through hardship after hardship after hardship after unfair after unfair after unfair after why me, and yet at the end of it he goes, my God can. And because of what he walks through, he's ready with the insight, the character, and the strength. All these things have developed in him, and he becomes the prime minister, number 2 guy in Egypt. He ends up saving thousands and thousands of people's lives. He ends up saving his own family's life that left him and abandoned him. And I think if I sat down with Joseph, I don't think he would say, oh yeah, super thankful for those 13 years. Like, I think he would look back on those and go, they were miserable. And yet, 17-year-old, shoulders back, chest puffed out Joseph could not have handled the power of being number 2 in Egypt, right? There's no way. There's no way he was ready for that. There's no way he had the character for that. And there's an interesting perspective here of, from my vantage point, remember right back in the beginning, I said there are seasons and times for me from my vantage point that I go, God, I don't feel like you're good. I don't feel like you're good. And yet from God's vantage point, couldn't there be a good reason for our hardship? From his perspective, from his vantage point, if John chapter 1 is true, is real, of Jesus being the one that created the heavens and the earth, don't you think from his vantage point, outside of time, beginning and end, don't you think there could be a good reason for some of the hard things in my life? For some of the hard things in your life? For some of the seasons that we walk through where we just go, God, I don't feel like you're good. Okay, and as you're taking notes, write this down. I think God cares more about our eternal soul than he does our physical bodies. I think God cares more about our eternal soul than he does our physical bodies. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8 says, godliness has value for all things. It says physical training is of some value, right? And that's not to say, I'm not saying that God doesn't care about our physical bodies. I think he does. But I also think he cares confidently. I think he cares more about our eternal souls than he does our physical bodies. 1 Timothy's getting at this point. If he says physical training is of some value, right? Like to beat our bodies, to train them to eat right, to be in shape, all those things is like, those things are important. And they prolong our life, and they give us the opportunity to share God's message and grow his kingdom and all of those things. But saying godliness is of value both here and in the life to come. See, if you're walking with us in a big church for any reason, they're going through the book of Mark, and this story in Mark chapter 2 kind of blew me away of Jesus showing up into this town and healing all these people. Right? Like, imagine if there was a church plant like in Oceanside, and somebody showed up and all of these like blind people were healing. There was like a couple hundred people there. There were like blind people being healed, like paralyzed people were walking, and like just these gnarly physical healings were happening. Like, don't you think news would be all over that, social media would be all over that, like, and then it would just blow up? Like, if it started with a couple hundred people, there'd be a couple thousand people the next week. This is basically what happens in Mark chapter 2. Jesus shows up on the scene, he starts healing all these people, and people are like, holy crap, this is nuts. We've never seen anything like this. And it says that in the Bible, holy crap, this is nuts. We've never seen anything like this. I'm just kidding. Don't say that. And it says the next day, the whole town showed up. And Chris Brown told this story of a dad with his little girl that shows up the next day, right? So day 1, all these healings happen. Day 2, a bunch of people show up because they heard about day 1. Make sense? On day 2, Jesus comes back from waking up early in the morning and praying. He says, let's go on to the next town. I came to teach. I didn't come to heal. And it seems like this super insensitive moment where you're like, Jesus, there's all these people that need to be healed. And he's like, that's not why I came. I care more about those people's eternal souls than I do about their physical bodies. I care more about their eternal souls than I do about their physical bodies. So what did he do about their eternal souls? He taught. And he taught this message of come through me and you'll be saved. Come through me and you'll find life. Come through me and you'll have life and life abundant, life eternal. See, you are so much more than just a body, 9th and 10th grader, that will live 70, 80, 90, whatever years it is in this room. You're so much more than that. And as we walk through struggles, as we walk through hardships, let us not forget the eternity that God has promised us with him, because John chapter 10, verse 14 says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. See, he's more interested in relationship that lasts eternally than he is about healing right here, right now, today. Now, that's not saying that he can't heal right now, right here, today. Of course he can. God is all-powerful. He knows all things, and he still uses that power to do incredible things. But if we find ourselves in a season where I don't feel like God is very good, or my mom is sick and God's not healing her, or something happens, this hardship happens, and I'm like, God, you say you're good, where's your goodness? Let us be reminded that his goodness is not defined by how I feel or by how good I feel he is. His goodness is defined by, I know my sheep and my sheep know me. There's an extension of relationship here. I want to close with a little bit of an analogy, and then I'm going to bring Michaela back up here. But I was talking to a buddy of mine this week, and we were talking about that Mark 2 passage of how insensitive it seems. Like, I still can't get past that. Of there were people that showed up that wanted Jesus, that Jesus didn't even go and see. Like that, it blows my mind. And yet, my buddy used this analogy of, imagine like we were all on a speedboat. It's a big speedboat. We're all fitting on there, okay? And we're out on the ocean, open shores, and we're like mobbing towards the beach. And all of us, we start talking about food. And you know, when a hungry group of people starts talking about food, you start like salivating. And you're like, oh my gosh, that sounds so good. Like, I want that right now. And we start talking about like In-N-Out and Chick-fil-A. And it's like, oh, that sounds good. Okay? To me, it sounds bloody terrible right now. I'm getting nauseous just thinking about it. But we're on this speedboat. We're talking about food. We're mobbing towards the shore. And all of a sudden, Trevor, I'll use you because I was mean to you earlier. Okay? So, Trevor, you get bucked off the boat. And it's going to be nice, I promise. Okay? You get bucked off the boat. And Trevor is in the water. And we turn around, we kind of do this big loop, and we come back around, and we're standing there, and we're like, I'm holding a life preserver, you know, one of those like circular things that's going to save his life with a rope on it. And I go, Trevor, what do you want? Like, what can I do for you? And it seems like a silly question, right? But it's a question Jesus asks all the time in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He goes, what can I do for you? What can I do for you, Trevor? How insane would it be in that moment as he's like drowning and waves are like crashing over his head? How insane would it be in that moment for him to go, Chick-fil-A, like I'm hungry still. Get me that In-N-Out. right? In that moment, you're like, homeboy, you don't need to satisfy your hunger. You need to save your life. Does that make sense? Like, if you're drowning and you just want like one last meal instead of choosing to not drown, there's something psychologically wrong going on. And that's the same thing that Jesus does in the Gospels. He goes, I understand you're hurting right now. I understand that you want like that hurt to go away. I understand that you want your blindness healed. I understand that you want life instead of death. And yet, you are an eternal soul. You're not just a physical body. So for me to just take care of your physical body and to neglect your eternal soul is actually not loving at all. The most loving thing Jesus could do is to come to teach about eternity, not to physically heal. Because even the blind guy would end up dead. Even Lazarus, who was raised from the dead, would go back to the grave eventually. The guy who had leprosy and his leprosy was healed would eventually die of another cause. See, Jesus said, you're so much more than a physical body, and I care more about your eternity than I do about your temporal right here, right now. So what do I do when God doesn't feel very good? And may we take a step back and live in view of eternity. Can we understand a God whose goodness is defined by an extension of relationship that changes not only my right here, right now, but my eternity? Make sense? Hey, I'm going to invite Michaela back up. I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to sing one last song. Father, thanks for the story of Joseph. God, and thanks for a story that we can open up in the Bible, and God, it's encouraging to me. God, just of his perseverance, his faithfulness, God, the ability to lean in for 13 years of his life. God, may I, right now, in this season, God, when things are hard, when things are tough, when I don't get it, when I say, why me, when I don't feel like you're very good, but God, would you give me the proper perspective of who you are? God, and the love that you have for me, and that your goodness is defined by you saying, I know you. I want relationship with you. I want you to know me. We love you, Father. In your name we pray. Amen.